Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another Thomas Apologia video. I haven't made a video in a while, and that is because I've been reforming a lot of my views and working out some new ways of justifying them. Now, in this video, I'd like to discuss some new foundations of Christianity, which are not the ones that I have laid out prior on my channel. And that's because I'm no longer a classical theist. Now, in this video, I want to argue that the doctrine of the Incarnation in Christianity is actually more compatible with neoclassical theism than with classical theism. Now, if you are someone who is a classical theist, and you hold on to that so tightly that you might even say, if classical theism isn't true, then Christianity isn't true, or something of that nature, which I've heard some people unfortunately say, I would just say don't tune into this video if that is going to harm your faith that much. However, if you are someone that might see some issues with classical theism and are looking for an alternative foundation for your Christian faith and don't know where to turn, I would suggest looking into neoclassical theism, and I will provide some reasons why I think that denying radical doctrines of God's immutability, etc., might be more suitable towards Christianity than people may have thought before. So without further ado, I'm about to read a syllogism, give justifications for these premises in the syllogism, define words, and give possible objections that a classical theist could give to my argument here, and why I think that radical conceptions of divine immutability and the Incarnation are not compatible. So premise one is just that every property is either 1, internal, or 2, external. Premise two is that the human properties of Christ are not external. Conclusion one, therefore, would just be that the human properties of Christ are internal. Premise three is that if Christ gains internal properties, he changes. Premise four, Christ gains internal properties in the Incarnation. And conclusion two from the premises is that therefore Christ changes. Now, why is that significant? Well, according to the radical conception of divine immutability, which is laid out by classical theists, God can't even so much as gain new real relations. He can't gain any accidental properties. He can't change in any sense of the word. There can be no real change in God. For example, classical theists take it even so far as that when they say God is the creator, they will say something to the likes of, well, that doesn't mean that God gains a new relation to creation or that there's something ontologically contained in God that makes him the creator, but rather what that means for them is that God is the creator insofar as creation on their part conceives of God as the creator. And just from that, you can see how radical this conception of divine immutability is. So when we're talking about this, we want to compare specifically this understanding of divine immutability with the Incarnation. Not like a neoclassical theist conception of divine immutability, which might just be that none of God's great making or essential properties could be lost. That is completely compatible with the Incarnation. So let's define some essential terms to this argument to try to avoid vagueness. However, if people do want to dispute these terms and try to redefine these terms, I think that it's perfectly okay to work with new definitions and adapt them to the argument. But the two terms that I want to define here is one, internal. What are internal properties? So internal properties are properties that subsist in the thing itself, or they are the individual subsistence of that thing itself. But the basic idea that will encompass all ideas of internal properties is that they are contained in the thing. And with external properties, they're just properties that do not subsist in the thing and are not the thing's individual subsistence itself, and they are not contained in the thing. So, for example, if external properties are assigned to a thing which it does not subsist in, it's usually because that predication is based on its perception from another. For example, as we explained earlier, with classical theism and how they understand God as the creator. But it also could be because of, like, let's say, this thing possessing something. Like, let's say we say the basketball team is up 50 points at half time. Now, they possess 50 points at the half, However, we wouldn't say that those 50 points subsist in the individual members or the basketball team itself. It's more of a virtual property that we ascribe to them. It's external. So what are some justifications for these premises? Well, premise one is a true dichotomy, as any property will either be contained in a thing or outside of that thing. Premise two will be that if the human properties of Christ are external, they subsist outside of the individual subsistence of the Word. If that's the case, they would have to subsist in another individual subsistence, which would mean that Christ's humanity would therefore be another person, according to how most Chalcedonians, according to their Christology, define what a person is, which would result in the heresy of Nestorianism, saying that Christ is two persons. So the conclusion is just following from the negation of one of the mutually exclusive options in premise one. So then premise three. The justification for premise 3 is that any acquisition of internal properties constitutes a change in that thing, in that individual thing itself, because what it is now contains more than what it was. Let's consider the following metaphysical axiom that I think that anyone who has any view of change or motion, etc., is going to have to agree with, even if you are an Aristotelian about change with act potency, or you hold to some other philosophical view about change. I think that everyone would agree to this basic axiom that, let's say that S is a subject and P is an internal property. If S comes to possess P, such that P now inheres in or is constitutive of S, then S has undergone a real and not merely a Cambridge change. That's a metaphysical axiom that I don't think will be challenged and is good justification for the third premise of this argument. Now, premise four. The justification for this is that Christ was not united to his humanity prior to the incarnation, unless we had some sort of an eternal incarnation. And if God had not chosen to create, he may have never even incarnated. As we have already established, then, Christ's human properties are internal to him as a person, and that he did not have them prior to his incarnation. This means that he gained these internal properties at the moment of his incarnation. So, following from premise 3 and 4, we then get to conclusion 2, which is just a conclusion from the prior premises of the argument. So, if we can show that this justification of these premises goes through unchallenged, then we can show that this argument follows that Christ truly does change in the incarnation. And this may be incompatible with classical theism, as obviously Jesus Christ is God, and classical theism wants to hold to a radical conception of God not being able to change whatsoever. So let's think of a couple possible objections that a classical theist could give to this argument that I've at least created. Right? So objection 1. Change occurs in the hypostasis of the word, but immutability is only applicable to the divine essence itself. Now, in Christian theology, the Son is identical to the divine essence, and hence, if the person of the Son could change, this may raise the question about the immutability or the mutability of the divine essence, and even whether under an Aristotelian framework, passive potency may exist in the person of the Son, as he has the capacity, at least, to receive these human properties in his hypostasis. However, let's sideline this point, as someone may use relative identity to say that the attribution of mutability to the hypostasis might not be reflexive with the divine essence. And they could also maybe say that they deny potency realism in Aristotelian analyses of change, and that may refute that latter point. But I think the primary issue here is something else, and I can see with this response is that it seems to undermine any justification for the classical doctrine of immutability in the first place. So take, for example, in this instance, we want to say that change can occur in the hypostasis of the Son, in the person of Jesus, but not the essence, because let's say that hypostasis is not always reflexive with all of the predicates for the divine essence, right? Such as maybe the begettingness of the hypostasis of the word might not be reflexive with the divine essence. Um, this also This could also justify seemingly non-classical theistic views of God. So think of this view of change not being applicable, or sorry, being applicable, however, it's not applicable to the divine essence. Well, views of theism which aren't really neoclassical, or sorry, classical, could actually fit in with this new understanding of immutability. So I'll just make up a position right now. For example, I'll call it neo-Scotism. So, for example, under Scotism, all of God's attributes are formally distinct. However, what if a Scotist was to just completely change his mind about some of the fundamental things in Scotism and just say, well, what if I want to deny that the formalities of God are immutable? What if they could be subject to change? And, well, the point here is that if they were to say this, they could retain the view that the essence itself is immutable, yet the formalities may be, and that may be irreflexive with the essence. And thus they seem to maintain this same definition of immutability according to classical theists, and yet it seems that they have completely denied classical theism. So there is also some other interesting points to make. So, for example, if the hypostasis of Christ changes, would that make the Son's hypostasis itself become temporal? Well, time itself is the measurement of change, and a thing is temporal insofar as it is subject to succession. That is, that it undergoes change. This would seem to imply that Christ is temporal, which, well, in the sense at least that we're using it, that the person of the Son is temporal, not just what we mean by the human nature of the Son, then this may seem to be problematic to classical theism and is not typically something that classical theists want to admit. So, objection 2. The second objection states that change on the part of the Son's humanity we can accept. We can accept that the human nature of Jesus Christ changes. He got hungry. He was birthed from the Holy Virgin Mary. He suffered and died on a cross. However, according to the person of Christ, did he change? We deny. Now, this argument that I have stated already is particularly targeted at the person of Christ rather than just his human nature itself. If the person of the Son's humanity is indeed internal, or sorry, his humanity is indeed internal to him, then as previously noted, because the acquisition of internal properties does constitute a change in that individual thing itself, as what it is now contains more than what it was before, this would therefore constitute change in the very person of Jesus, and not just his human nature itself. So let's consider a third possible objection. This objection states that the human qualities of the Word are not internal, as internal properties are only internal to an essence. These properties, therefore, are only internal to the humanity of the Son, but not to the hypostasis. Now, this objection presupposes a very narrow understanding of internal properties, which is not how this argument uses the terminology. Internal properties are still internal to a being's hypostasis insofar as they are contained within it. For example, my essential properties do not subsist apart from my individual subsistence, myself, but rather exist in it, and thus they are internal to me, the individual. And this objection also supposes that if an individual experiences some change in their essential properties, it does not constitute a change to them as individuals. This, however, is false, as it assumes that change can only be done with the taking away or the editing of hypostatic properties themselves. So, for example, the taking away of the hypostatic property of the Son, which is him being begotten, or editing of that. However, this is not the case that it's just due to that. For example, as an individual, we can ascribe change to myself insofar as I acquire accidental properties. For example, if I get a new haircut, there might be something accidentally different about my properties, and thus I have changed. However, that haircut didn't modify, edit, or make me lose any of my hypostatic properties. But what's most relevant here is that the human properties go from not inhering or being contained or even being predicated of the person of the Word to then inhering or being predicated of the person of the word, which would then definitionally constitute a change. Possible objection number 4. Perhaps God can acquire new properties, such as being a creator. However, this is not on the part of God changing, but on the part of his creation. And this is what we call a mixed relation. Similarly, the person of the word gains intrinsic properties, yet not as change on the part of the person of the word, but on the part of his humanity. So this objection is harkening back to what I noted before on how classical theists understand attributing things to God, like him being a creator, or perhaps when we say God is the savior of the people of Israel out of Egypt, or something like that. Those may be new properties that we ascribe to God, which we would not have ascribed to him sans creation before anything existed. However, we ascribe to him in virtue of creation and how we perceive him. So, what's the issue with this response? Well, when scholastic theologians note that God can acquire these Cambridge changes or properties, such that being the creator, they do not mean that these properties literally inhere or are contained in God, but rather they mean that these properties are ascribed to God from the perspective of creatures, while God meanwhile only bears mixed or virtual relations to creatures, which means he doesn't have any real relation to creation on the part of himself. These properties spoken of, therefore, would be external. So, God being a creator would be an external property under classical theism. God saving the people of Israel out of Egypt and thus being the savior would be an external property or an external Cambridge change under classical theism. And thus, this isn't comparable to the Incarnation. As when we say that God the Son was crucified, we do not attempt to mean that the flesh of the Son was crucified, which we can ascribe to the Son via its perception to the Son on account of creatures. That would just flat out be the heresy of Nestorianism. No, we mean that the person of the Son, God, truly died on the cross according to his humanity. Now, objection number 5. Now, I should note that I think that this is probably the best objection that I could conjure up against the argument. However, I still think that it fails. If anyone would like to suggest any more possible objections to the argument, I'll be more than happy to entertain them either in my Discord DMs or in the comment section. And if I do think that your objection is successful, then I will humbly accept that this argument doesn't follow through. And it would be a good breakthrough to be able to undermine arguments such like this if you do manage to refute this argument. So let's read objection 5, which is most of the justification for these premises relies on an idea that the human properties or the human essence of Christ, human nature of Christ, is ontologically contained in him via subsisting in the person of Christ. This is not the case. That the properties subsist in the Son, we deny. That the properties take their subsistence from the one individual subsistence of the Word, we concede. But this constitutes change to the person of the word, we deny. So, a nice little example one might give of this is, for example, when a seal is pressed into wax. The wax may take the form of the seal without changing the seal itself. Similarly, Christ's humanity terminates in the person of the Word. The humanity takes the subsistence of the person of the Word, and yet the Word remains unchanged. So, what are some issues with this? Well, I think the key issue with this argument is that it seeks to highlight gaining internal properties constitutes change. So, the argument that I've presented, the main highlight of it is that when you gain internal predications or properties that can be ascribed to you, that is going to constitute as change. And it's not as much focused on the nature of how the human properties take their subsistence. However, let's take a look at this example used. Well, in our seal and wax example, we may concede that there is no change here in the seal. However, that's because the new properties are gained by the wax and not the seal. So if the seal had gained some type of new property, then this definitionally would constitute some type of change. Similarly, here in the Incarnation, the person of the Son gains these new properties that we can assign to him, and thus definitionally would constitute as change. Now, let's quickly go over what we mean by like real properties or predications, because these real properties or predications that are ascribed to things are not virtual precisely because it's describing something ontologically true of that thing. Such as when I say that the ball is red, it's not merely that the ball causes some type of redness or gives redness to another, or it's not that the ball relates to redness in some strange way. It's that the ball really is red. And likewise, when we say that the word is human, we're not just saying that the word just gives subsistence to the human nature, but we're saying that the word really is human. Whereas external properties are true of the thing insofar as it's perceived to be the way, or perhaps when it possesses something that is descriptive of its ontology, such as that's not descriptive of its ontology. So, for example, when we talk about a man and his bank account, the bank account isn't ontologically contained in the man. Or when we talk about a basketball team and their possession of 50 points at half time, so, therefore, when we say that the Son has become man, we do not mean that the Word is merely acting upon humanity, as the seal does with the wax, but we mean that the Word becomes the suppositum of the human nature. And when we say the Son is crucified, we are not saying the man who is associated with the Son is crucified. We are saying the person of the Son, who is God, suffered according to his human nature. Thus, as the Son still gains real properties according to previously laid out metaphysical axioms of change, we can therefore say that the Son changes, and that seems to significantly undermine doctrines of classical theism. However, with that being said, I hope that this video brings new perspectives of both neoclassical and classical theists alike, and that it encourages more talking points. With that being said, it's Thomas Apologia. God bless.